how would perhaps you would describe C.S. Lewis's wrestling with that suffering, and how later, when he became a Christian, turned back to that suffering and perhaps had a Christian outlook towards it instead of that atheistic, pessimistic stage or approach to that suffering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, again, there are lots of sort of complex reasons around his conversion to Christianity, and it was a sort of drawn out and very rational procedure. But at the same time, for Lewis, the reason and imagination were two sort of separate facets of his personality, but ones that he felt worked together critically to be able to sort of help him to understand the world. And so I think he when he describes that process of conversion, again in Surprised by Joy, he talks about it in this very rational sense that he just came to feel that he couldn't really believe in anything else. It seemed like it was an unavoidable truth. He talks about being pursued by God. He wasn't trying to become a Christian. He, in fact, quite the opposite, because he felt that if he became a Christian, he would have to give up so much of his own freedom in terms of what he thought and how he acted. And so he, in a sense, he's trying to avoid that. But at the same time, he talks about God closing in on him. And that the final chapter of Surprised by Joy is called Checkmate. It's that sense that he's got no other moves to make. He can't avoid the inescapable truth that the God that he was so determined not to meet had actually come and confronted him. And he talks about it having to sort of at that point give in and accept. He says, I'm at that point the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. That's his conversion to theism. So not to Christianity. At that point, he's just accepting that there is a God. It took him longer to come to accept the Christian faith. And that process, again, was a combination of a very rational, but also of a very imaginative turn. So for Lewis, as I'm sure come on to, stories, myths were really important ways of trying to understand the world and understand the concept of belief. And so he talks about in Surprised by Joy that when he was in his teens, he first encountered a book by George MacDonald, who was a very favorite writer of Lewis's throughout his life, called Phantastes, a kind of fairy story. And for Lewis, it was completely transformative. And one of the reasons for that, as he says, is that he felt that by reading that book, it had baptized his imagination. So it was the kind of book that he always read and was always fascinated by, these kind of romances of other worlds and of a kind of supernatural fairyland. But this one, I think, it helped him encounter the concept of holiness, the idea that there was a kind of enchanted world which we were blind to because of our rationalism, but which actually was always out there. We just need to be able to find it and see it and understand it and appreciate it. And that's where imagination and the baptized imagination was so central, I think. And so those kinds of elements were at play for Lewis. But what also was important for him in terms of accepting the Christian faith was the influence of some of the people that he had met and come to know in Oxford. And critically, his fellow English academic, J.R.R. Tolkien, someone who had had a very similar kind of background to Lewis, similar upbringing, had come to Oxford also to study classics, but had switched to English and was now in Oxford, having done a short stint at the University of Leeds, had come back as the professor of Anglo-Saxon, and they met each other in 1926 at a meeting of the English faculty. That's pretty much, Lewis had started his job at Magdalen in 1925. So it was just as they had begun their careers together in Oxford, they met. And it turned out they realized they had an awful lot in common. They had slightly different views to to the syllabus and to the way that English should be taught, Lewis was much more interested in literature, and Tolkien much more interested in language. Again, for those people who've read The Lord of the Rings and all the invented tongues that you meet there, we know that Tolkien was famously a philologist, someone who was interested in language. And so they had those sorts of disagreements in terms of what they thought the most important part of studying English was. But they had grown up both loving George MacDonald, William Morris, those kinds of writers, and had very similar outlooks. The major difference between them, apart from the philology, was the Christian faith. And I think that, again, was an important factor for Lewis. One of the things he recognized in himself was that he was a great lover of writers like Milton, Spencer, and others. But the thing that he couldn't understand is why these people were all Christians. And in fact, he found that was a hurdle for him to understand and appreciate their works, was they're all coming from this perspective. And then, of course, Tolkien the same. He found at this point that someone who he had a great deal in common with and had great affection for was also a Christian, coming from that same outlook. And I think that was also something that Tolkien felt as a kind of loss gap between the two men, was that they agreed on everything else, but not this. And he was also obviously keen to try and help his friend to come to appreciate something that was so sort of central and fundamental to Tolkien's life and sort of worldview. And so there's this famous conversation that the two of them had with a third member of the English faculty, a man called Hugo Dyson, who was another friend of theirs. And the three of them, having had dinner one night at Magdalen College, went for a walk round Addison's Walk, which is around a sort of big water meadow that's out at the back of the college. And while they were doing that walk, sort of 9 o'clock at night kind of time, they had this conversation about the nature of myth, which seems to have been quite fundamental to Lewis's acceptance of the faith. Sort of took him over that final sort of hurdle. That stumbling block was sort of removed through a conversation that was really about him trying to deal with an objection that he had in his own mind, that he felt that he appreciated myth, particularly Celtic myths and Norse myths, classical myths, and that he felt that the Christian story was similarly another myth, and that he didn't see any reason to believe that one over any of the others. In fact, if he could have chosen, I think he'd have gone for the Norse mythology because he just liked it more. But what Tolkien and Dyson tried to explain to him, and which is the kind of the change that he came to in the end, was that you could have myths and you could have true myths, or a true myth, rather, one that stood out above the others because the events that it described actually happened. And that's part of it for Lewis, was that the historicity of the story was something that he had to confront. But I think he also felt that that didn't deny the importance of the pagan stories. So the idea of a god sacrificing himself, dying and coming back to life, that those could be suggestive stories that point towards the truth, even though they themselves are not true. And that Christianity might be a true myth that works on us in a similar way to the other stories, but with that tremendous difference that it really happened. That for Lewis was the key point, I think, was that that he could still appreciate those stories. And of course, he believed very strongly in the idea of stories as mythical stories, which could be teaching something of the truth without themselves being true. He went on to write right at the end of his life, Till We Have Faces, which was a myth retold. So that the Cupid and Psyche myth, sort of told in a way that was still in a pagan, pre-Christian setting, but one that clearly has implications for Christians. So stories that have a resonance beyond their own sort of literal account.
Thank you for watching this short segment of an interview with Dr. Simon Horobin on C.S. Lewis. If you enjoyed this interview and want to watch the whole interview, you could check out the whole interview. The link will be in the description below. Furthermore, if you would like to listen to more interviews on leading scholars in the field, then make sure to like and subscribe to stay tuned to this channel. Also, if you would like to support us financially on Patreon to keep this mission sustainable and allow me to continue reaching out to these leading scholars, then consider checking us out on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Those would be brilliant ways to help support this platform. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next one. God bless and goodbye. I'll see you soon.